Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and it's the show for Wednesday, September 29th, 2021. And in late 1850, Lysander Spooner published a pretty widely read pamphlet, at least for the time, A Defense for Fugitive Slaves, where he argued against the constitutionality of the hated Fugitive Slave Acts of 1793 and 1850. He also made the case for how to deal with it through resistance and nullification on a state, local, and individual level. So on this episode, I want to highlight some of his strategy from that pamphlet, but also point out that the foundation that he used to start with, that he built this on, and his advice on how to defeat federal programs without relying on the federal government to limit itself was really nothing new at all. It was really a reaffirmation, and you may find this surprising from Spooner, for those of you who are aware of him, that he was reaffirming what supporters of the Constitution had to say during the ratification debates. So let's get right to this. I'm going to check in the live chat a little bit later on in the show, but I want to dig right in and start out with this paper, A Defense for Fugitive Slaves. Of course, I will link to all of these in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's available for free to read online at libertyfund.org. Here's their overview, and we're going to get into some details in Spooner's words here right off the bat. They say, since, in Spooner's view, slavery was both unjust and unconstitutional, men and women held in slavery had the right to flee, and other people had the right and the duty to help the runaway slaves escape to freedom. This meant violating the Fugitive Slave Acts and breaking the law, but these acts would be in the freedom-loving spirit of the Constitution. That's a nice introduction for that pamphlet. And here's some quotes from Spooner himself, and this is actually one of my favorites here. He says, "To say that an unconstitutional law must be obeyed until it is repealed is saying that an unconstitutional law is just as obligatory as a constitutional one, for the latter is binding only until it's repealed." And he gets into the strategy that a lot of people want to use today, which is, we'll worry about that later. They pass something that they're not supposed to, so we'll first comply with it. We'll vote the bums out. We'll get some new people in there. We'll get them to repeal it. But we got to keep being law-abiding citizens throughout. And Spooner fully rejects that. The founding generation fully rejected that view as well, which I covered recently in another episode. He said there would therefore be no difference at all. So if you have to obey an unconstitutional law, because we look at this Constitution as the supreme law of the land, and acts outside of it are void, whether or not the government says so, because the government doesn't hold sovereignty. The government isn't final authority on itself. That's how it's supposed to be, and that's the case that Spooner himself is making here. If you have to obey an unconstitutional law, that's saying that there's no difference between a constitutional and unconstitutional law in practice. Everyone has to follow it until the government says one way or the other. So we're slaves to the government in that situation. He says there would be no difference in respect to their binding force, and that would be equivalent to abolishing the Constitution and giving to the government unlimited power. It's pretty powerful stuff there from him. And this is what he starts out with. This is his basis for that view, which is an unconstitutional statute is no law in the view of the Constitution. It is void and confers no authority on anyone. So there's a supremacy that's higher than government in the American system. This is something that Spooner had studied. He obviously understood the arguments of the founding generation of the American Revolution. He recognized that people who advocated for the Constitution made this exact case, maybe not the exact same words, but pretty close. And I'm going to show some examples here in just a few. And he wasn't making up anything new. He was literally just reiterating exactly what those big name the biggest government supporters, the biggest big government supporters of the founding generation were saying this exact thing. An unconstitutional statute is not law. It is void. That exact phrase, "it is void," was used over and over. And then the people of the several states, the people who ratified the Constitution, they did so under that understanding, because the advocates of the Constitution were saying, this is how it is. And so therefore, they understood the document as to meaning that. Now, before getting to that, I just want to mention that you can find everything you need to follow this show over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. That's where I'm going to link to in the show notes. Links to the stuff that I'm referencing here. Of course, Spooner's article, or Spooner's pamphlet, plus a couple of other episodes that I'm going to mention in a few minutes, plus some original source documents from the ratification debates from people I'm going to cite. You can find all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream ones like YouTube, Facebook, Twitch, and Twitter, but we also live stream on Odyssey.com. We have archive editions over at Gab, MeWe, Minds, and all over the place, and a podcast audio-only edition as well. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I appreciate you allowing me just that quick moment. I want to get back to it. Here's Oliver Ellsworth. As I was mentioning, Spooner was really just reiterating what leading founders. Now, Ellsworth was a strong, ardent Federalist supporter of the Constitution, arguing for ratification. He ended up being nominated to serve as the Chief Justice of the United States. He was the third. The second one wasn't there very long. So it was John Jay. I forget who was number two, but the confirmation whole thing was a fiasco. And then Ellsworth was the third one. So he was a guy from the Federalist Party. He supported big government in comparison. I mean, they all supported small government, except maybe Hamilton in comparison to the people of today. But if we're grading on a curve, he was one of the big government guys. And here's how he put it in the Connecticut Ratifying Convention. If they make a law which the Constitution does not authorize, it is void. Now, this is not just some radical Patrick Henry or radical anti-federalist or Thomas Jefferson somewhere in the middle there saying this, that if they make a law outside of the Constitution, it's void. This is not just Spooner saying the same thing, an unconstitutional statute is no law in the view of the Constitution. This is the third Chief Justice of the United States, the head dude on the Supreme Court, nominated by Washington, supported by Hamilton, and the rest. Here's another guy. Roger Sherman was kind of a middle-of-the-road dude. He was in support of the Constitution. He said it this way in a letter in December of 1787. All acts of the Constitution not warranted, all acts of the Congress not warranted by the Constitution would be void. Just period. Void. And then here this one is Governor Samuel Johnston, someone we don't hear about too much, in the North Carolina Ratifying Convention. He said, when Congress makes a law in virtue of their constitutional authority, it will be an actual law. Now, he wouldn't say an actual law if he was recognizing that some laws are not actually legitimate. So he's saying if they're making a law in pursuance of the powers delegated to them in the Constitution, it's an actual law. He said every usurpation, now a usurpation is an exercise of powers not delegated to the government in the Constitution. He says every usurpation or law repugnant to it cannot have been made in pursuance of its powers. He's talking about the Supremacy Clause. He says the latter will be nugatory and void. Again, not the exact same phrase that Spooner used in 1850, but very similar. We can see where Spooner recognized this tradition because Spooner, even though in his 1870 appendix to No Treason, wasn't really a fan of the Constitution at all, he recognized that you could actually look at the document and understand the legal arguments behind it. And that's what he was doing here in his 1850 pamphlet, A Defense for Fugitive Slaves. Now, Jefferson, of course, he wasn't one of the big government Federalist supporters of the Constitution. And in fact, he said he's neither Federalist nor anti-Federalist in a letter to Francis Hopkinson, because he would, if he had to have a party before he went to heaven, he said, I would rather not go there at all. But here's how he put it in the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798, November 10th, 1798. Whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. Again, there's that word void, just like Spooner was using in 1850, just like Ellsworth was using in 1788, and Johnston. And get this, even this guy, the hated Alexander Hamilton, in Federalist number 78, he put it this way: there is no position which depends on clearer principles than that every act of a delegated authority, contrary to the tenor of the commission under which it is exercised, is void. No legislative act, therefore, contrary to the Constitution, can be valid. So if you're delegating them stuff to do and they go outside of it, it's automatically void. In theory, in principle. And now those of you still thinking about Spooner, because this whole episode is about Spooner's views, really, we know that it should be obvious that waving a document in front of the most powerful government in the history of the world isn't going to do a single thing to stop them. Of course, I've covered in other episodes James Madison, John Dickinson, and others referring to the Constitution as a parchment barrier. Madison, most famously in Federalist 48, specifically said there has to be something else outside of demarking on paper the boundaries of the various departments of the government. Here, back to Spooner. He says, so if its unconstitutional statute is no law, he says the right of the people, therefore, to resist an unconstitutional law is absolute and unqualified from the moment the law is enacted. Notice he's not saying, okay, you can resist an unconstitutional law after you've protested for a while, after you've petitioned for a while, after you've tried to vote the bums out and maybe they get it repealed or maybe they don't, or after you take it to court and you have the courts first decide. No, that is all counting on people to first comply with an unconstitutional act. And if the Constitution is the supreme law of the land and government doesn't hold sovereignty, the people of the several states hold sovereignty and final authority, then, therefore, you don't have to wait for government to tell you it's okay to stop following a law that the government wasn't supposed to make in the first place. This is keeping the government in check without relying on the government to limit its own power. The right of the people, Spooner said, to resist an unconstitutional law is absolute and unqualified from the moment the law is enacted. Now, of course, I covered this just last week, an episode, What's the Deal with All the Obedience? This doctrine to the founding generation, to the old revolutionaries, was called passive obedience and non-resistance. And I covered many examples of how leading founders and old revolutionaries, Samuel Adams, James Otis, John Dickinson, and others, totally rejected the notion that you first have to comply. The recognition from people like Dickinson and Hancock was if you comply, and this is specifically how Dickinson put it in response to the Stamp Act of 1765, if you comply with the act, you're riveting perpetual chains around your unhappy country. Now back to Spooner. He says, the right of the people, therefore, to resist usurpation on the part of the government is strictly a constitutional right. I like what he's saying here. I actually disagree. I think calling something a constitutional right is actually saying that the right is derived from the Constitution. And I see where he's going here. And I actually see it as a natural right. And in fact, the leading founders who actually advocated this principle were a little bit more hardcore than Spooner. People like James Iredell, who I'll come up with in just a moment, he actually called it the inherent right of the people. And when you're talking about inherent rights, these are rights of our nature. We have this whether or not a document says we do or not. But he's trying to make the argument to win the case of the day in 1850 that it's okay to resist. He's encouraging resistance. So I think he's being a little political here. Maybe he was just still evolving in his views like we all do over time. This right of the people, Spooner said, to resist usurpation on the part of the government is strictly a constitutional right. And the exercise, and this is where I think it's most interesting, the exercise of the right is neither rebellion against the Constitution nor revolution. It's a maintenance of the Constitution itself by keeping the government within the Constitution. So if the government tries to enforce stuff that it's not authorized to do and no one goes along with it, then the government doesn't get to enforce stuff that goes outside of the Constitution. It may have the laws on the books, but they're not able to enforce this. We're seeing this play out before our very eyes on a number of issues. We're starting to see that expand and grow, the pun is intended, in many, many states on some issues, in dozens of them, and we hope to see more and more of that over time. Spooner goes on, he says, this is also this right to resist. And this is where he gets back to the natural rights view that he should be so known for. It is also a defense of the natural rights of the people against robbers and trespassers. Pull no punches on government. When they exercise powers not delegated to them, they are committing robbery because they have to rob from you in taxation to pay for those offices that are doing this stuff, those agencies that are doing stuff that they're not supposed to do. They're trespassing on your rights. Sometimes they're trespassing on your property. They shouldn't be there in the first place. It is a defense of the natural rights of the people against robbers and trespassers who attempt to set up their own personal authority and power in opposition to those of the Constitution and people which they were appointed to administer. Now, this was just what James Iredell. This was also one of the first justices on the Supreme Court. I think he was number 3 or number 4 as far as associate justices. He was on the first round with John Jay, nominated by George Washington. Here he is in the North Carolina ratifying convention in July of 1788. He's basically saying the same thing that Spooner is. The only resource against usurpation, the only resource, he's not saying it's a good idea to try later on. The only resource against usurpation, an exercise of powers not delegated in the Constitution, is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise. However, the people may decide to do that. But he says this is how it happens. This is the case in all free governments in the world. The people will resist if the government usurp powers not delegated to it. So here's Lysander Spooner sounding just like a Supreme Court justice, an associate justice, a Federalist supporter of the Constitution back in 1788. I think that's fascinating, but I do like how the message is consistent. It's a natural rights message. It's asserting and reaffirming the sovereignty that the top of the food chain is supposed to be the people. Now, if the people choose not to do that, then they're voluntarily putting chains around themselves. That's what John Dickinson told us would happen if the people complied with the Stamp Act. You voluntarily rivet those chains. Here, back to Spooner, he also recognized that resistance, with that would come prosecution attempts. Government isn't just going to back off. And a lot of people think that nullification efforts just means okay, well, a state is going to say this is illegal, and so therefore it's overturned and no one's going to try to enforce it. Well, government isn't a bunch of good people. Obviously, we live under the largest government in the history of the world. We live under the largest empire in the history of the world. These are not nice people. They aren't just waiting to be told, okay, you got to stop doing this. Everything will be okay. Oh, a state, South Carolina, said we're not allowed to do this anymore. Okay, darn, shucks, well, we tried. No, they're going to keep pushing. And Spooner recognizes, even Sherman did. Now, Sherman, when he made that case of, let me see if I can pull this one up again. He said, all acts of the Congress not warranted by the Constitution would be void. He followed up by saying, nor could they be enforced against the will of the majority of the states. So he was even recognizing at the time that when government tries to do stuff that it's not authorized to do, it's going to try to enforce those provisions, and it's going to create a rift if the states resist that. And in that situation, it's the people of each state, because the people are the final authority. It's just that we're divvying it up on a state-by-state level to decentralize. So he's saying, nor could they be enforced against the views of the majority of the states. I'm butchering that paraphrase, but I will link to the original document in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. So again, Spooner is recognizing, like Sherman did back in 1787, that usurpation comes with it a threat of prosecution. And Spooner's response to that was jury nullification. He says, and inasmuch as a single dissentient in the jury is sufficient to prevent a conviction, it follows that if the government exercise any powers, such as substantially the whole people intended it should exercise, it is liable to be resisted without having any power to punish that resistance. So if the people of an area believe in liberty and people start violating federal acts that shouldn't exist in the first place, and the federal government tries to prosecute them, then the people in that area, because there's an overwhelming number of them who believe in the right of something, then when they get selected for a jury, there's going to be jury nullification. We saw this actually play out, and Spooner had a lot of impact on this in the 1850s in response to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, especially in places like Syracuse and in Wisconsin and other places where people escaped slavery. They got captured by some federal robber and trespasser, kidnapper, really. And then they were either broken out, or when they tried to prosecute people, there was jury nullification. So it's this combination. You have to recognize that we're not going to, like Thomas Jefferson, go from despotism to liberty in a feather bed. Resistance comes with risk. Spooner knew this, Sherman knew this, Jefferson knew this, but the only way to keep liberty, the only way to advance liberty, the only way to keep government in check, the only resource against usurpation, according to James Iredell and many others, is resistance. Now, Spooner was talking about something that another Federalist supporter of the Constitution was talking about as well during the ratification debates in Massachusetts. That's Theophilus Parsons. If you listen to this show on a regular basis, you definitely have heard me mention his name. Most people wouldn't know who he is, but he was kind of like, as far as like being a renowned speaker of the time, he was probably right up there with someone like Patrick Henry. Not as historically known, but people in Massachusetts said to him kind of offhand, you could read through these in letters and things like that. They were basically saying to him, man, if you were on our side, it doesn't matter what the issue is. If you were on our side, we would win because he's such a powerful speaker. But here he is in Massachusetts in the ratifying debates in 1788, saying basically what Spooner was saying, that, okay, there's something out there that has to be resisted. So the people resist it, and then the government is still going to try to prosecute, and then there's this tool of jury nullification. Here's how Parsons put it. The people themselves have it in their power effectually to resist usurpation. Notice it's not beg or sue against usurpation or vote bums out. It's resist usurpation without being driven to an appeal to arms. This is the moderate middle ground. Thomas Jefferson considered nullification, and nullification could be on a state, a local level, an individual level, a jury level. Nullification is the moderate middle ground between unlimited submission and violent, bloody revolution. So they can resist without an appeal to arms. An act of usurpation is not obligatory, said Parsons. It is not law. Again, this is that message of void. And he said, and any man may be justified in his resistance. And that's what Spooner was saying as well. He said this resistance, it's unqualified and unlimited from the moment the law is enacted. People can resist it. This is a moral principle. Parsons went on. He said, let him be considered a criminal by the general government. So if Washington, D.C., well, it wasn't Washington at the time, passes something or enacts some law that they're not authorized to, the people resist it. Washington, D.C. would then consider them criminals, try to prosecute him. But, he says, yet only his fellow citizens can convict him. They are his jury. And if they pronounce him innocent, not all the powers of Congress can hurt him. And innocent they certainly will pronounce him if the supposed law he resisted was an act of usurpation. I covered this trial by jury as a defense against tyranny in an episode a little over 2 years ago now. I haven't listened to it in a while, but I will link to it in the show notes. I know the information in there is really good. Thomas Jefferson said, I consider trial by jury as the only anchor yet ever imagined by man by which a government can be held to the principles of its Constitution. And the only reason you need trial by jury is if people are resisting stuff that is unconstitutional in the first place. So you can't just say, well, we're going to pass something and everything's going to be okay. Or we're going to change the people in power and everything's going to be okay. Or we're going to change the words of the document and everything's going to be okay. Maybe they will change things for the better for the short term, but in the big picture, if we zoom out and look at the big picture, as long as people comply with stuff that the government isn't supposed to be doing, the government is going to never stop adding to that list. And that is why we have the largest government in history. That is it, probably, I would say, the number one reason why, because people don't resist every small usurpation of power. They haven't for a long time, and now it's going to be much, much harder to flip things around. I am hopeful for the very long run. I am very cynical in the short run. But Jefferson is saying this trial by jury, just like Spooner, this is the way you keep government in check. You have to resist, then you need people in your community to protect you when they come after you. Here, one more that Spooner has to say, and this is a response to the, well, just vote him out. He says, it is no answer to this argument to say that if an unconstitutional act be passed, the mischief can be remedied by a repeal of it. It's no answer at all. He's basically brushing this off. Because this is what we hear all the time. We heard this, just choose new people, get it repealed, and everything will be fine. Thomas Jefferson very specifically told us in his draft around October-ish of 1798 for the Kentucky resolutions, he said, vote the bums out. That strategy was for an abuse of the delegated powers. That's the constitutional remedy to Thomas Jefferson as well. When they do stuff that you don't like, but they're still within the delegated powers, vote them out. But where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, said Jefferson, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. Just like Iredell said, just like Spooner said some years later, this is the only resource against usurpation. Again, it's no answer to this argument to say that if an unconstitutional act be passed, the mischief can be remedied by a repeal of it, and that this remedy may be brought about by discussion and the exercise of the right of suffrage. Because if an unconstitutional act be binding until invalidated by repeal, the government may, in the meantime, disarm the people, suppress the freedom of speech and the press, prohibit the use of suffrage, and thus put it beyond the power of the people to reform the government through the exercise of those rights. Now, we've seen all kinds of things play out, like they have disarmed the people, and they've been doing this for decades and decades and decades. They've suppressed freedom of speech for a long time. And because people say, well, we got to get that repealed, or we got to get the courts to tell us it's unconstitutional, rather than saying it's unconstitutional, we will not comply, that's why it stays on the books. And of course, we were warned about that. Now, I covered much more of Spooner's views in response on just the Fugitive Slave Acts, specifically in an episode back in May, Lysander Spooner versus the Fugitive Slave Act. I will link to that in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. I hope you'll check that out if you haven't yet. Now, before heading out, I want to take a quick look over in the live chat. I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope you're learning something, or at least getting you to think and encouraging. Now, resistance, of course, it comes with risk. That doesn't mean we just have to, on every single issue, have a hill to die on, because there's so many. So we have to be smart about our strategy. Thomas Jefferson, specifically after passage of the Kentucky resolutions of 1798, the day later, he sent them off with a letter to James Madison. He said, you know, we have to hold to all these principles, but we should push as far as events will render prudent. Taking a look, Josh Clements says Lysander Spooner, anti-slavery, pro-secession, and actually a pretty highly respected, although somewhat controversial, legal scholar on the Constitution itself. At the end of that book, or that pamphlet, when you scroll down, if you read through it at Liberty Fund, he actually, when it was published, had all kinds of like 5-star reviews from different papers around the country. Gunnai says, at the end of the day, any government will become corrupt no matter what is on paper. And that's incredibly important. That's exactly what Benjamin Franklin said on September 17th, 1787. This is the day we look at as Constitution Day. This is a speech that, well, James Wilson gave, but it was written by Benjamin Franklin. He was a little older, so Wilson gave the speech, but it was Franklin's words. He said, you know, there's a lot of things that I don't like about this Constitution, but we got to move forward. Let's get this thing ratified. And at the end of the day, this will only end in despotism, as all governments have before that, because he knew that even if he recognized, or he thought, the people of the time believed in more liberty, he said that's only going to last so long. And eventually some people in the future are going to have to deal with stuff. And that's a very, very important point. Power corrupts. We know that old adage. But power always seeks to expand. Abigail Adams said, power is ever grasping. Samuel Adams said, power is intoxicating. So whatever power you give them, even the tiniest amount, they're certainly going to try to expand on it. Josh for Liberty says he also did a masterful job of describing why the Constitution itself is null and void. He's referencing no treason, the Constitution of no authority. It is fun how a lot of people point, whenever we talk about something regarding the Constitution, some person who hasn't read much by Spooner will just post one little quote from an appendix in his 1870 book out of context, as if just talking about the Constitution is stupid, when Spooner himself did this for decades, and he was highly respected for it as well. I do want to say hi to Alan Hughes, Blue North, Jimmy D, Richard Banks, Liberty Revolutionary. There's Gun Eye, Salt Lakers. It's the Supreme Court determined that you can refuse medicine if you're sick. I'm not sure. I think we should all have our own choice over our own bodies. We should make our own decisions as long as we're not harming other people. And certainly we can do those things whether or not the Supreme Court is agreeing with us as well. S98 April, Tim Martin. That Liberty Gal, and everyone else, I appreciate you spending some time with me today. If you enjoyed the show, you like the information, you like the work that we're doing, you can help us spread the word by smashing the like button, leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, subscribing, getting notifications, comments in the archive. All these things trigger the algorithm primarily of the mainstream platforms you watch or listen on, and it tells those platforms to show the program to more people. And of course, if you want to put your financial faith behind our work, I couldn't be more grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us today. Don't feel any obligation because we're going to continue doing this show all the time. Next week, my schedule is going to be a little bit off. I might not do a show on Monday, but we'll see because I'm traveling to D.C. this weekend. I hate being there, but I'm going to be around a lot of friends and doing a speech covering some of the Spooner stuff as well. Anyways, so don't feel any obligation to join us, but if you're able to and you're able to pitch in as little as $2 a month, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members is the link, and you know what to do. Again, I appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I'll see you on Friday here on the Path to Liberty.